You don't know what you don't know, plain and simple. And for us in the miniature painting hobby, a lot of times what that translates to for newer painters is a paint job that doesn't come out the way you thought it would. Maybe you used all the recommended colors of paints that were on the back of the box art, and then when you stand back and look at your mini, it doesn't look anything like the box art, and you're wondering where it all went wrong. Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Richard here from Crash Course Hobbies, and today I'm going to talk to you about the 5 most common mistakes new miniature painters make and how to not make them. The first one is not thinning your paints enough. I don't know how many times I've looked on Reddit at people posting my first paint job, critique it, whatever, and the paint looks chunky, it's not smooth, there's texture on the model. And this is a really common mistake, because unless you know, you're probably just gonna dip your brush directly into the pot of paint or use something like a paper plate or a hard palette or something to put your miniature paints in. Well, it's really important to thin your paints, and it can kind of vary how much you should thin them based on the brand. If you were to use something like Vallejo or Citadel, those tend to be kind of more on the medium range, so usually just adding a drop or two of water from your brush into it and kind of thinning it out until you want it to cover the model well, but not start to kind of separate and pool in different areas like a wash might. But a lot of this kind of comes with feel and getting familiar with each paint brand and how it kind of acts. Or if you use something like Pro Acryl, which is already kind of thin on its own, you might not use as much water to thin that out, also depending on the colors and all these kind of things. So there's really no magic formula to tell you how much to thin your paints. All I can really tell you is spend time with them and, just make sure, if anything, thin them down a little more than you think you probably should, and if you notice it separating on the model and not covering well, maybe do it a little bit less and go from there. Another super common mistake that people tend to make is not letting the paint completely dry in between coats. If you don't let the paint dry before you put the next layer on, your brush strokes are going to leave a texture on that paint because it hasn't fully dried yet. And so you've got this kind of like half cured, half kind of think of like a bunch of mud in the ground. And if you walk through it, you're gonna leave footprints. Whereas if you let it dry, you're not gonna have footprints there. It's the same kind of thing with your paint. So you wanna make sure that, say you're painting a cape or whatever it might be, paint that cape with one coat and then go and paint a different part of the model, let that cape dry, and then hit it again. The nice thing is that thin down miniature paints tend to dry very quickly, and time between coats really doesn't end up being much more than 30 seconds or so in most cases. You could also use like a hair dryer without the heat, just to kind of get it drying a little bit. You could also use like a box fan in your office or whatever you might do, just get some airflow on it, but 9 times out of 10 that's not even required. Just wait for it, work on a different part of the model, and you'll find that you get a lot less of the weird textures and a much smoother paint job overall. Another really common mistake I see people making when they're posting their first models and things like that is not adequately scraping mold lines. You don't even really need to go too crazy with it here. Just the back of a dull razor blade or something like that, 1 or 2 passes over the mold line most of the time will do wonders for it. Definitely more than just ignoring it. And the thing with mold lines is if you leave them on the model, especially if you're doing a method like contrast or even just putting a wash on it, that change in the texture of that model, it really accentuates the mold line and it becomes very obvious. It looks unnatural. It's very clear that it's not supposed to be there. So I would recommend at any point during the process, if you notice there's a big ugly mold line somewhere, especially on sort of the top half of the model, if it's on an underhang or something, I would just say forget it. Nobody's gonna see it anyways. But if it's like a big one on a weapon or a face or a big armor panel, I would recommend, no matter where you are in your paint job, scrape it, reprime it, repaint over it, and just fix it when you can. It's one of those things that you kind of get better at over time. You'll learn where on the bit that the mold lines tend to be and you can address that. But more often than not, it's a really easy way to make sure your paint job looks higher quality for very little effort. Next, look, I've said this before in another video, but I'm gonna say it again because it's super important. Don't prime your minis outside with a rattle can on a humid, wet, gross day, because you're gonna end up with lots of gnarly looking texture and gross stuff, and there's really no fixing that once you get to that point. So make sure you prime on a warm, dry day, and if you're using a lighter color spray paint, especially a white spray paint, I would recommend soaking the can in your sink in warm water for 5 minutes and then shake the absolute crap out of that can for like another 3 to 5 minutes. And then test it on some other stuff before you spray it on your miniatures because it's really easy to ruin your nice, pretty, expensive minis with a bad priming job. This is probably as good a time as any to mention that 93.8% of you watching this channel are not subscribed yet, so what are you waiting for? Help my sense of self-worth, hit that subscribe button, let's keep going. Another mistake that a lot of people tend to make is assuming that a wash is kind of a go-to for every surface of every model. And while clever uses of washes can be put to lots of great uses, I find that there's a lot of other times too where washes really tend to hurt the overall effect than anything. So things like capes, I don't recommend putting washes on. I like to just put my own shadows and highlights on a cape because it's really hard to not get the weird pooling and coffee staining on something like that. You know, things like armor panels, musculature, more organic things take washes really, really well. Very large flat panels like something like a Tau battle suit or a cape or something like that tend to not take washes very well. So kind of experiment with it, but also realize that you don't have to put a wash on everything. And then I'm going to throw in a bonus one because this is also really, really important. And this does kind of go into the basics of miniature painting, but it will save you a lot of time. And that's starting in the recesses. I think a lot of people, they start and they just think like, oh, well, the sword is cool. I'm going to paint the sword first. And then I'm going to paint the shield next. And then I'm going to paint the armor. And then you realize there's a bunch of little recessed bits, like take the joints in a Space Marine's armor, for example, or something like that. Highly recommend always starting with the most recessed part of the model first and then working your way up to the more raised stuff as you go, because it's way easier to clean up the mistakes or the areas where you accidentally get paint that you didn't want to as you go, instead of having to go back and fix that area where you're definitely going to get it on other stuff. And so you're creating less work for yourself overall. It's kind of a work smarter, not harder type thing. Anyways, guys, that's it for this one. I may do a part 2. Unfortunately, there's a lot of mistakes that new painters make, and I don't want to put them all in one video because it would be too long. But anyways, thank you so much for watching. Please continue to support your local game stores. I'm so grateful to have you guys here. So if you haven't already, please be sure to hit that subscribe button. But as always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.